a little bit about myself. I don't know if I did an intro slide next. No, I didn't. So I'm a registered dietitian in the US. I live outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And I have spent 18 years living on a working organic farm. And when I became a dietitian, which was a second career for me, I was in food marketing before that, I noticed how many of the professors were telling everybody that going vegan and vegetarian was the best thing they could do for the planet. And I noticed this dialogue getting more and more strong. And the farm where I had been living was growing vegetables. The leftover vegetables were feeding the animals. The animal manure and bones and blood were going back to feed the vegetables. And so as somebody who was already very sold on paleo ancestral ways of eating, I thought how we grow it is the same as, we need to go back. And so it just made immediate sense to me as somebody who already had that framework of we need to go as natural as possible, that vegan and vegetarian type diets are like a step in the opposite direction. It's like a step backwards. And there's a lot of money behind this movement. And so my goal is to help all of you who are already sold on this have better arguments at dinner tables and in elevators. And so my book, Sacred Cow, is available. We've sold a bunch already, but there's still a few left down there. And I have a film called Sacred Cow as well. The film and book are very, very different. The film shows you everything in practice, but the book really gives you the arguments. I even have in the beginning like a choose your own adventure guide where you can, does meat cause cancer, page 61, So I go through all the common arguments. I've been in this space a long time. I know all the arguments. So my practice is Sustainable Dish, and then I started a nonprofit called the Global Food Justice Alliance to try to fight back against the global movements of the anti-meat narrative, and it's getting really strong. So I'll talk a little bit about that today. So this is my Instagram, and I'm quite vocal on Instagram, pushing back, and I've really noticed a big shift from my followers on Instagram. I used to post something like this and then brace myself for 2 hours of my thumbs working to try to push back, and now my followers are pushing back for me so I don't have to do it. So it's gotten really great. I'm really happy about that. Bill Gates is one of my least favorite people in the world. He is the largest owner of farmland in the world. He is going to make a lot of money from the anti-meat narrative. It is all about taking monocrops grown in a chemical way and transforming them, ultra-processing them into basically fiber bars that they want the world to eat, and not allowing people to have the right to choose their own diet and to produce their own food. It's a really, really sinister situation. And not many people know this. They think, oh, well, what's wrong with schools just getting a little more vegetables and fruit on Fridays? That's not what's behind vegan Fridays and meatless Mondays. It's a big corporate grab. And unfortunately, people have been really obsessed with this idea of carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. And it is something that we do need to work on. But it isn't the only problem. And the reason why everyone is so overly focused on carbon emissions is because when you think of these plant-based alternatives, this is the only leg they can stand on. So they can't win on any of the ecosystem functions that grazing animals can perform. They can't win on equality, human health, regional economies, or workers' rights. So emissions, and I'll talk a little bit more about the difference between the biogenic cycle coming from cattle and fossil fuels and how those are very, very different types of emissions, comparing apples to oranges. But when we break things down in a reductionist way and just look at pure emissions, who wins from that argument? Beyond Meat, the oil industry, the ultra-processed food industry, and of course Beyond Burger and all the stakeholders in Silicon Valley who are investing in this next big boom, which I think is going to collapse. So I promise I'm a better illustrator than this. I actually was an art teacher in my undergrad. But I wanted to draw this because kids get this. It's very, very simple. We're harvesting solar energy in the most pure form and upcycling it into the most perfect food for humans, while we're increasing biodiversity, both underground and above ground. Underground biodiversity is very, very important too for soil health and for sequestering carbon. So this is a system that Beyond Meat can't beat. The reason I call this project Sacred Cow is because sacred cow means an idea, custom, or institution held especially unreasonably to be above criticism. So it's just assumed that cows are unhealthy. It's a perfect trifecta. It's worse than butter could ever have been, right? It's a perfect trifecta of it's going to kill you, it's going to kill the planet, and you're a bad person for eating it, right? So, completely misunderstood. And the reason why there's not other people like me pushing back is because there's nothing to sell here, really. It's also very tricky to make this argument. Some people might understand the nutrition argument, but they don't understand the environmental argument. So I come to health conferences like this, and I tend to just educate a little bit more on the environment. But I'm also visiting farms, and I try to educate them a little bit more on the health argument. Try to help everybody with the ethical argument, but you can't have an intelligent ethical discussion about whether or not it's okay to eat meat without fully appreciating the nutritional and environmental implications of what it looks like to remove livestock from our food system. So this is the Meatless Mondays campaign in the US. The New York City public school system has adopted this. It's the largest public school system in the US. And so again, I get people telling me, well, what's wrong with kids eating salad on Mondays, and we're already eating too much meat, and what's your problem? You're being a fanatic. And I'm not a carnivore. I believe that vegetables are also a healthy thing for people to eat. But it's the propaganda that I have a huge problem with, because these types of messages are up in the schools, from kindergarten all the way up through, pre-college, all the time, all week long, telling the kids that meat is a bad thing. So these are all untrue. The meat sector does not produce more greenhouse gas emissions than all of transportation. That's false. Reducing your chance of getting diabetes by 15% is statistically insignificant. It's not a causal study that they're referencing here. And there's no evidence at all that eating protein causes kidney problems. Once you have damaged kidneys, it's harder for your kidneys to process protein. But it's kidney disease is not caused by overconsumption of protein. But yeah, we're getting it from everywhere. So this is Vox News. This was an Instagram post that they put up. And you can see that, Americans are killing 174 animals per person per year. 137 animals are shrimp. It's completely irresponsible journalism. So through the Global Food Justice Alliance, I'm using that platform to really push back and called them out for unethical journalism. So there is a code of ethics that journalists are supposed to follow, and they're not supposed to be, showing things out of context or misrepresenting or oversimplifying ideologies. And that's exactly what they're doing. The New York Times is doing the same thing. This was an open letter to Mayor Eric Adams, who calls himself a vegan, although he eats fish. And, extolling the virtues of vegan diets to kids in New York City. 70% of the kids in New York City that go to school are low income, 10% are homeless. There's never been any evidence to show that removing meat from children will benefit them. Never. And there's never been any evidence to show that pulling meat away on Mondays or Fridays will benefit the environment. So now you've got food insecure kids who are home on the weekends with poor food choices, and now you're taking away the most nutrient-dense part of the meal on Mondays and Fridays. So giving them 4 days in a row of food insecurity. And these are actual pictures of what vegan Fridays look like in the schools. So again, when parents come to me and they say, you're being so dramatic, this is so ridiculous, what's wrong with a little salad on Fridays and Mondays? This is not a little salad on Fridays and Mondays. They're getting brainwashed into thinking that meat is bad. And also, when you think about the types of foods inner city kids eat, right? It's burgers, mac and cheese, sandwiches, things like that. They're not gonna go get a $12 quinoa bowl with chickpeas and kale on it, right? They're gonna go to the sandwich shop and just ask for a sandwich with no meat. Like, that's the result of what's gonna happen. And so when we look also at what's happening in the science community, we're seeing bias from them too, and this is really scary. So has anyone here heard of the Global Burden of Disease study? Okay. This is what the UK food policy is set upon. This is what most global food policies are set upon. So in 2017, you can see here, diets and red meat were only responsible for just a sliver of deaths they were attributed to. But in 2019, you can see that that red bar went way up by a factor of 36 in 2 years. When this was published in the Lancet, there was absolutely no evidence to go along with it. And that was against the code of the Lancet. And the Global Burden of Disease is the Lancet, which is a pretty reputable journal. So I'm part of a meat summit that's going to be happening in Dublin, where we're going to be generating a white paper. I'm going to be one of the authors of it. We're going to be pushing back against this. It's two of the main authors that wrote a letter to the Lancet demanding that this get retracted. It's not going to get retracted. Have organized the summit. It's going to be a really big deal. We're hoping that this paper is going to be the next version of Livestock's Long Shadow that everyone's going to be referencing when they talk about meat. But you can see the bias against red meat is coming now from young people who are now afraid to order milk at Starbucks because of peer pressure. It's happening in the schools, it's happening in the media, on Instagram. It's a very powerful force that's happening right now. And now it's coming from science. This Global Burden of Disease paper gets referenced in all other journals, right? So right in the beginning, when you read a science paper, it'll say, we all know that meat is likely to kill you. Footnote, Global Burden of Disease study. We also know that vitamin and mineral inadequacies worldwide are largely the nutrients found in animal source foods. Iron, and this is not just happening in developing countries, this is happening in the UK and the US. Iron deficiency among women and children is the most prevalent nutrient deficiencies worldwide. Guess what the best source is? B12 is the second. Guess what the best source is? And this is a paper just showing how are we going to combat the most common nutrient deficiencies. And we've got it in order here: liver, spleen, kidney, cheese, beef, eggs, bivalves, heart, canned fish, goat. Dark leafy green vegetables, that's for folate. But every single other thing is an animal sourced food. The exact foods they're trying to take away from people. This is the only study that we have that was a randomized controlled trial that looked at meat versus less meat, and it was in children in Kenya. One group of school children got a meat supplement in school, one group got a milk supplement, one group just got extra calories, and one group was the control. They rated the kids on 3 things: behavior, physical abilities, and behavior, and the meat group far outperformed all the other groups. Interestingly, the next group that did well was the over-calories group, not the milk group. And I think that's because milk inhibits iron absorption. In most of Africa, in order to supplement the schools, they're giving milk. So I think, not that I have this huge issue against milk, but it just shows that milk is not a substitute for meat. We have to have actual meat, not milk. The United Nations Food System Summit in 2021 was how I started the Global Food Justice Alliance. They are largely influenced by the Eat Lancet. You guys have heard of Eat Lancet? Yes? Okay, this diet, this is a quote from Eat Lancet. A Norwegian billionaire is the person that commissioned this diet. She flies around on her jet and she tells people not to eat meat. So while meat is an important source of key nutrients, blah, 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 you can only have a teeny tiny little bit. And so if you were to break out 98 grams of red meat per day, 98 grams of red meat per week per day, that's about the size of one blueberry per day. You can have 2 blueberries worth of eggs, of chicken per day. You can have 1/8 of an egg a day, but you can have 31 grams of sugar per day. Oh, yeah, that's just showing the weight in blueberries. So I'm particularly irritated with Eat Lancet because it is right now what we have as sort of the benchmark planetary health diet. And there's been more papers coming out about how this planetary health diet is inappropriate to sustain human life. And they never even consulted any environmental experts when they made this diet. So, meat is highest in satiety, lowest in calories, has the most bioavailable nutrients. Whenever there's a nutrient that you can find in plant sources and in animal sources, the body always prefers the animal source of that nutrient every single time. And so there's benefits for obesity and for malnourished because, of course, we can all appreciate the benefits for malnourished populations to give them some meat. But also in obese populations, when you increase someone's protein, they're going to naturally eat less because meat is so satiating. So I'll talk a little bit more about the benefits of increasing meat and what protein goals should be, but they're way too low, the protein goals in the UK and the US. And you can still meet your protein goal, yet be deficient in amino acids. And there's been studies on this where people are getting poor quality proteins. What are poor quality proteins? Pea protein, other legumes. They're deficient in certain amino acids or low in certain amino acids. And so really we need animal source proteins. So we need to also stop comparing land to calories. So you see these studies saying, well, we could produce, 3 tons of potatoes or only 1 cow on this acre. And that's really short-sighted, and I'll get into why in a little bit. The biggest winner when we vilify meat is the ultra-processed food industry because it takes the blame off the ultra-processed food industry, and we know that almost 60% of the Western diet is ultra-processed foods. But it's very complicated, right? Because the minute you start explaining greenhouse gases, then they say, well, what about cancer? You explain correlation doesn't equal causation, and we don't have a direct cause for cancer, and they'll say, well, what about the water footprint? What about the land use? But it's wrong to kill beautiful animals. And so that's why you don't see a lot of people doing the work that I'm doing, because it's slightly crazy-making. So I'm going to try to go through some of it. Again, the argument is better in my book. But the WHO report showing that bacon is a definite carcinogen, they're showing just because something is a risk, like going out in sunlight is a risk of skin cancer, doesn't mean that it's the same level of risk as smoking cigarettes, which we know is a 30 times higher, more chance of you getting multiple types of cancer, right? So with bacon, everyone in here has a general risk of getting colon cancer. It's about 5%, all right? 5% chance in 1,000 people. If you were to eat 5 slices of bacon for the whole rest of your life, your chance goes from 5% to 6%. But the media spins that to a 20% increase. And that's what you read in the headlines. And with red meat, they're saying it's likely to cause cancer, just like Roundup is likely to cause cancer. They just haven't been able to prove it because it's just really difficult to do those types of studies. But we have 0 studies at all implicating red meat in cancer. And of course, these are all based on diet recall, which people lie on. And there's been studies on why people lie and how they lie. But they're much more likely to remember that they had a burger last week or 3 weeks ago or 3 months ago, because some of these diet recalls go back a full year. But they're much less likely to remember the sugar-sweetened beverage, the deep-fried potatoes, the deep-fried apple pie. They're much less likely to remember that they smoke, and they're less likely to remember that they drink. They're not going to report that on these because they know it's bad. It's called healthy user bias. And so diet recall is just a horrible way to collect information. And again, correlation is not causation. So just because something is associated with something else, it doesn't mean that it's caused it. So here we can see, this is a really cool website. If you can make this out, tylervigen.com. You can compare movies that Nicolas Cage has been in to the mayonnaise consumption in the state of Maine and see how that works out. But just because people eat chicken, it doesn't cause crude oil imports, right? But that's the same logic that the media is using when they talk about red meat is associated with cancers. There's lots of things that are associated with cancer. So is it the meat or is it what we eat with the meat? And I would argue as a dietitian that this burger, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, a burger, even if it's not grass-fed, still has iron and B12. It's not a poison food. It's, for someone who can't access grass-fed meat, this is still going to be, a plain burger is going to be the best choice on this slide right here. And so advocating, this idea of less meat, better meat, I think is a little bit on the elitist end of things. And a lot of people in the nutrition world understand this. In 2 days, when I go out to this grass-fed beef farm and talk to farmers who raise pastured meats, that doesn't go over very well. Because they think that, unless the meat is totally pastured, it's like poisonous, and that's just not true. When they've studied people that shop at health food stores, so that kind of adjusts for lifestyle, people that shop at health food stores are less likely to smoke and drink, they're more likely to do yoga and take supplements and get sunlight and do all the things that we're talking about here at this conference. When they've compared those populations, meat eaters and vegetarians and vegans, they found absolutely no difference at all between vegetarians and omnivores, and actually vegans were found to be less healthy. Okay, but don't we all need to cut down on meat? Aren't we all eating too much meat? And there's this perception, especially among Americans, that all Americans are sitting down to a tomahawk steak every single night. But the actual consumption of beef in America is less than 2 ounces per person per day. So that's, I don't know what that is in grams. Someone could do the math, but it's not that much, less than a couple bites. So chicken consumption has gone way up, seed oil has gone up, and I think I have a slide here. Here we go. So between 1970 and 2017, which was the last data set I could get, we can see red meat consumption actually has decreased. Poultry consumption has gone way up. It's gotten cheaper to produce poultry. Salad and cooking oils has gone up, and that's not olive oil, that's these ultra-processed seed oils. And then grain consumption has gone up, and that's not like steel-cut oats, that's ultra-processed foods. Oops. I already mentioned this, so it's almost 60% of the diet in the West is ultra-processed foods. So, I talk about why meat is healthy, and then I talk about how it can be done in ways that are good for the environment. So the difference between monocropping and the type of agriculture that I really advocate for is absolutely massive. This is what goes into Beyond Burger, and on the left is your meat that's largely British meat, is largely pasture-produced meats. Okay, no chemicals required. Keeping that soil covered is the way it wants to be. Tilling the soil immediately starts to release carbon. It allows for a cooler ground temperature, better wildlife habitat, it's actually cheaper. There's less inputs required. The end product is much more nutritious, and you have just overall a healthier ecosystem. So that's the biggest difference between Beyond Burger and even beef. And one thing people don't know is in the US, even when the beef is finished on a feedlot, it doesn't spend its entire life on a feedlot. So the majority of all beef spends most of its life on pasture. If it's finished on a feedlot in the US, or increasingly in other countries like Brazil, it's only 3 months of its life. And while it's on a feedlot, half of its diet is corn, yes. The other half is leftovers from the food industry or the ethanol industry, like the ground up corn stalks from the ethanol industry can actually go into producing protein. That stuff has no other use in our food system anyway. So they're actually it's a net food upcycler, a net protein gain for our food system. The difference nutritionally between grass-fed and typical feedlot beef is not massive. I go into that a little bit more in the book. I know some of you are going to ask me questions about that, so I will try to head that off at the pass before the end of my talk. But I went through every single published paper and was really not able to find a hugely significant difference. Even when you look at omega-3s, glyphosate, antibiotics, I mean, I really looked at everything. And I think at the end of the day, it's really important. It means that meat is nutritious, period. It can be done in ways that are better for the environment and more ethical for the animals, but meat is a healthy product, period. This is not regenerative. There's nothing regenerative about lab meats, about Beyond Burger, about any of that process at all. So what goes into making lab meats? It's this same process, and that's what the lab meat companies are not telling you. That's what Beyond Meat is not telling you. So you just pick a monocrop, ferment it in a lab under climate control. You're going to need lots of antibiotics because lots of other things want to be growing in this petri dish too, in addition to meat. When you can just use the solar energy directly, thermodynamically, that is the best use of the sun, is producing grass. Grass absolutely requires grazing animals for it to be healthy. All right, nutrition. So, beans versus steak. Steak wins. You need to eat about 4 times the calories of beans to get the same amount of protein that you can get in a 4-ounce, about 100 grams or so of steak. So first we're looking at the amino acids. And then we've got the minerals and the vitamins here, and you can see that beef wins. And these are also nutrients that are hard to get in other foods. So zinc is a challenge to get from plant-based foods. B12 is impossible to get from plant-based foods. Iron, it's very tricky because there's lots of anti-nutrients in plant-based foods that are blocking absorption from minerals. So beef wins. Beef is better. Next. Okay. Not all land can be cropped. That's what won me my book contract with the same publisher that published the China study. It's a vegan book publisher. This is the argument that really turns people around and at least makes them go, oh, maybe I got it wrong. So most of the Earth's surface is either too rocky, too dry, too brittle, or too hilly to be able to turn into a field of wheat or corn or soy. But in many of those places, livestock thrive and actually require grazing animals in order for that land to be healthy. So grazing animals can take nutrients from the valley floor, they can bring them up the hills, so it's not just only washing down. So cattle and other ruminants can turn food we can't eat on land we can't crop into the most perfect food for humans to consume. That's my elevator pitch. Oh, and here's the paper that I was chatting with someone else about. So we were talking about, well, you know, with everyone buying carbon credits or investing in farmland, who is you? Okay, here's the study. Here's how we're going to get investors excited about investing in grazing. So this was a study that showed the ecosystem services in the U.S. on public land of just regular grazing, not the difference between continuous and regenerative type grazing, which I talk about in the film, over $1,000 per head. Grazing animals provide ecosystem services, and so it is even better than just keeping that land fallow. You have to have the grazing animals on it in order to keep that land as healthy an ecosystem as possible. So grasslands and cattle evolved together, and they must work together in order for the ecosystem to be healthy. Livestock turn food we can't eat into protein. This is just another slide. This is all livestock. So this is including pork and chicken, which raised in an industrial way, they eat 100% grain. So even if you're at the grocery store and you're not sure if it's grass-fed or whatever, beef is more nutritious than chicken and pork. Beef had less grain than chicken and pork, and they were not raised 100% indoors under fake lighting in really horrible conditions. So beef wins even when we're talking about typical meats. Beef is about 30% more nutrient dense than chicken. Okay, methane. So this is the US, and you can see our transportation and energy generation and industry far outweigh the 2% of US greenhouse gas emissions from cattle. This is just trying to put things into perspective. Worldwide, the number is about 5% because you have to balance less developed countries. They're going to have a lower percentage of cars to cattle, like India has a little more cattle per car. This slide just shows the difference between the methane emitted from cattle and how it's part of this complex, beautiful cycle, and the difference between that and fossil fuels. All these slides, you can share them. They're available on sacredcow.info under Learn Infographics. So the cattle are eating carbon. Grass is carbon, C. It's going into their rumen, and the bacteria in their rumen are converting that into, they're digesting everything. They're translating that carbon into fatty acids, so cows are actually keto. And then the cow is belching out CH4 methane in the atmosphere. It mixes with oxygen, and after 10 years, it breaks into CO2 and H2O. So H2O is water. It becomes part of the water cycle, comes down as rain. The CO2 is taken up by the grass in photosynthesis, and the O2 comes back. That's what we breathe. The C, carbon, becomes the grass, becomes the roots, and then there's this beautiful symbiotic relationship between the roots of the grass and the microbes underground, and this is like the magic that happens with carbon sequestration. So the microbes need the carbon. The roots need the nutrients that only the microbes can bring to them and the fungal networks. And so the fungal networks are underground, mining minerals from rocks, feeding that to the roots of the plant in exchange for the carbon. So it's this kind of exchange that's happening. Trees do the same thing. Up to about 40% of that carbon can get sequestered. We're also building new soil. So there's a lot of people that say, well, there's a max that the land can reach. It can become like carbon saturated, but they're not counting that you can actually build soil on top of it. So it can become deeper, higher up. And so it just becomes part of this process. The carbon becomes part of the cow, generates meat and milk. The manure goes back in. So that's a very different process from extracting ancient dead animals, fossil fuels, and just pumping them directly into the atmosphere. It doesn't have the same balanced equation. Does that make sense? Okay. The water argument. So there's different ways of measuring water. There's green water and blue water. The blue water is when you look down on a map and you see lakes and streams, the blue patches, that's blue water. Aquifers are also blue water. Green water is rain. It's the moisture in the grass, the moisture that's already in the environment. The majority of the water footprint for cattle is moisture that's already in the environment. 10 minutes, perfect. And And so when people say it takes 10 bathtubs full of water to produce your burger, they're comparing blue water because that's irrigation that they would have used for cropping. But the actual blue water footprint is very, very small. So I go into that more in the book. So it's a different way of measuring water. And also, only 42% of the animal is boneless cuts. The rest is all used. And when I was down in Brazil just a couple weeks ago, I was at a leather factory looking at car leather production. And, Tesla is not using leather anymore because they're eco, but that was the only biological piece of the car. That was the only eco piece of the car was the leather. Volvo's doing the same. So in Australia, I've heard they're burying hides. They just have too many hides, and it's not even worth it for them to turn them into leather. They're just letting them compost and rot. Eliminating meat would do more harm than good. This was a study that looked at the United States and what would happen if we got rid of all livestock production in our food system. What they saw was that overall calorie consumption would go up. We don't want that in the US. 70% of Americans are overweight or obese. Carb consumption would go up, and again, that's not like steel-cut oats and pearl barley, that's ultra-processed foods. And then we would have a rise in nutrient deficiencies as well. And the greenhouse gas emissions, if we got rid of all of it, would only be 2.6% reduction. So think about that compared to meatless Mondays, and it's just not even gonna move the needle at all. And then there's the environmental food print of obesity, which is also another form of food waste. But just think about all the plastics involved in managing diabetes, from the Lancets and the little strips and everything. We also have dialysis, the end result. There's so much plastic usage in hospitals as the result of people eating a poor diet. I think that should be also factored in. If we're going to be vilifying cattle, we need to be vilifying ultra-processed foods and the downstream effects of that as well. Better meat is not elitist, so I get this question a lot, and I looked up the price of organic grass-fed beef in the US. The average price at the time when I looked these up was less per weight than even conventional strawberries, a Starbucks drink, vegan protein powder, imported goji berries, which are now being called regenerative a lot of times, which really drives me crazy, and cookies and candy bars, even if you buy them in bulk. The omega-3 thing. So a lot of people have heard there's a better ratio of omega-3s in grass-fed beef compared to typical beef. And while that is true in some studies, not all studies, some studies have shown like twice as much omega-3s. It's still not a lot. That's like saying 2 pennies is twice as much as 1 penny. It's still not a lot of money. So you would still need to eat about 3 pounds of grass-fed beef to get the same omega-3s that you would get in a very small piece of salmon, or 9 pounds of the conventional beef. So overall, if you're looking to get someone's omega-3, 6 balance adjusted, have them eat less processed food and a little more fish. Switching someone, if they're eating beef 3 or 4 times a week, to grass-fed beef just for the omega ratio is pretty meaningless. Poultry is really high in omega-6s. Like if beef's here, poultry's like here, especially turkey. So we just need a little context before we start touting like the health benefits of pasture-raised meats. People do feel better eating it. People want permission, so they can feel good about how the animals are treated, about the environmental benefits of pasture-raised livestock. But when it comes to just trying to help the masses eat better, like basic whole foods type eating, meat, vegetables, a little bit of fruit, things like that, just the basics. Let's get people off ultra-processed foods. That's the biggest fight we can win. So, through the Global Food Justice Alliance, I really try to take that halo away from the vegan diet and talk about that diet as a privilege. I think it's totally fine for people to be vegan. It's a choice that people deserve to make on their own. I get a little nervous when I hear about parents feeding their children a vegan diet. We don't have long-term studies on the outcomes of that. The US says it's okay. Germany and Switzerland and Belgium say it's not okay for pregnant women, nursing women, or infants, children, and teens. And so I think the US needs to get a little more evidence-based with their recommendations there. But that's the main goal for me with this organization that I have right now, which you can join, globalfoodjustice.org. So this is how you can find me. The book is available downstairs. The film, Sacred Cow, which is available here on iTunes, and the Global Food Justice Alliance. And I think I have a couple minutes for questions. Thanks. All right, anyone?
Well, first of all, thank you so much. We really love your work. And I was just very curious about what you said around Meatless Monday and all the vegan things that are going on in school. Do you also see that happening more and more within corporation?
Do I see that more and more happening with?
With corporation. So, for example, a lot more vegan recommended or vegan mandated. I would love a little bit more on that.
Especially LA and San Francisco area. Netflix actually flew me out for coffee to talk to me about buying my film. Sat on it for 3 weeks longer than they said they were going to, and I think what was happening, it was going up the ranks. Almost everyone in LA is a vegan, and even though they were excited at the idea of a counterpoint documentary to all their vegan documentaries, at the end of the day, they wouldn't even take it. So yes, we're seeing that in governments not allowing meats at government-sponsored meetings, and in corporations as well.
Raise your hand again. Thank you. Yeah, this question is about the grain and the silage, so the alternative things that cows are fed. I've noticed that although the cows are mostly healthy, sometimes the introduction of like the supplementing diet seems to be causing them issues, whether that is grains or like fermented silage that's got mycotoxins issues. So I wondered, it might not be affecting the quality of the meat so much, but the health of the animal. And if you've sort of, with you living on farms, if you've noticed like what's going on there. Thanks.
Yeah, so they're doing more research now into different additives like tannins, which are actually even trialing in celiacs right now, and I'm part of this experiment. I'm celiac, with these tannins that are not only reducing methane but reducing inflammation in the gut. So they're actively trying to see how they can make those ration balances healthier and better. It's cheaper for them to produce, like especially down in Brazil, it's hot down there. They have a different type of cow that takes up to 6 years to finish on grass. If they finish on a feedlot, it's cheaper for them. They can do it in 2 years. And so there's just like we've got a lot of humans, we have to feed them something. Meat is healthy. This is an affordable way to produce meat. There's ways they can do it that are better for the animals. It's still ideal to do pasture raised, but it's not like a black and white thing. There's so much nuance to that. So yes, it can throw their microbiome off. It doesn't 100% of the time, and they're working to improve it.
Hey, thank you. Could you talk to us about the Amazon and cattle?
Yes. Good question. Okay, when you hear Brazilian beef, you think burning the Amazon, right? Everyone thinks that. So I just got back from there, and it's a very complicated situation that's happening there. So basically, you've got a lot of really poor people living in the Amazon region. When you clear land there, you get to own it as part of government policy. Okay, so that's the number one problem. What they do first is they clear the hardwoods off. Brazilian hardwood makes wonderful furniture and flooring. Then they burn it. Then they bring cattle in to graze it because it's not yet ready to be cropped, but the best thing that they can do at that time is bring in cattle to graze down like the scrub that's still there. Some of that cattle does make it illegally into the beef industry there. It's a very, very small percentage of the overall beef industry, but some of it does make it in, and it's really hard because cattle switch hands like up to 7 times before it actually gets processed. After the cattle are done grazing it and they get it nice and level, they plant soy. That's the most profitable use of that land. The soy oil goes into ultra-processed foods. That's the number one reason you would plant soy in Brazil. The second reason is to produce soy cakes, which is a byproduct, which goes to feed chickens in China. So it's not cows driving the process. Cows are one step in the process, but of course it's easier to tell Brazil that they're destroying the rainforest. And by the way, England, Europe, and the US were all forced at one point, and we all got pretty rich on deforesting our land and turning it into what it is now. I'm not saying that means Brazil gets to ruin the rainforest, but I'm just saying I think it's just it's interesting for now upper income countries to tell lower income countries that they're not allowed to develop themselves. Anyway, it's a very complicated story.
I've got an almost 8-year-old son who has decided to be vegetarian since last autumn. Have you got any tips?
How old?
Almost 8.
Almost 8.
Yeah, so
okay.
It's more for like the cruelty to animal side of thing than environmental, but any tips for trying to convert him back to me?
Yeah. I don't have firsthand experience because my kids just, like the more tentacles, the better for them. Like they were like, it's really tricky with kids because they're also getting it reinforced from their teachers at school as well. One, I would say sneak it in and just like make bone broth and say that it's vegetable soup or whatever, That's just like the nutritionist mom in me. I would just do it. I would recommend, if you can, to actually have him work on a farm. Every vegetarian and vegan that started working on the farm where I had been living was not a vegetarian or vegan after 1 month of working there. They were too tired physically, and then they also realized like chickens are kind of stupid. So if he like has an actual experience working, he'll realize that chickens are not like a teddy bear. They're just like really dumb birds. Yeah. One more?
Last one, yeah.
Okay.
Does it not bother you that the animals are dying in fear?
Does it not bother me that the animals are dying in fear? No. When we look at any food production system, there's death. Whether we want to accept it or not, it's going to happen. So when we look at the system, the monocropping with the tractors, so much death is happening in that. First, in order to make a field to grow a crop, you have to annihilate whatever was naturally living there. So the bunnies, the deer, Bambi's gone, right? And then you have to plow it. That kills life underground. You have to then often use a lot of chemicals, which are getting rid of insects. So now the birds have nothing to eat. Yeah, no, you don't have to. Okay, so I lived on an organic vegetable farm. What do you think we used as fertilizer? Don't have to use fertilizer. I didn't use glyphosate. I used bones and blood. So you have to have animal input. There are no systems in nature that do not have animals and plants as part of it. So if you acknowledge that death is part of it, whether you're going to eat a steak on your plate or not, right? That death is just an inherent part of what creates life. Oh, yes, you can let death happen naturally. So natural death, have you seen National Geographic? Like natural death is being eaten alive by a hyena. So it's not like just closing your eyes in your sleep and just curling up and like angels come down. It's... So natural death means wolves, it means all kinds of horrible things. There's no like natural peaceful death that happens in the world. So if you acknowledge that death must happen, and I know at a longevity conference we all just don't want to think death happens, right? But death does happen. And so if you acknowledge that death does happen for food, then you can be, and we talk about this in the film, you can choose to participate in the death that encouraged more life or that destroyed more life. And in regenerative agriculture, it's the death that actually enhanced ecosystem function. Okay. We're going to wrap up. I can't hear what you're saying anyway. Okay. Thank you.